Okay, we're ready to begin the lunch part of our program. I'd like to introduce to you Yusuf Dahl, CEO of Century Progress in Allentown and founder of the Real Estate Lab in Allentown. And he is going to give you all sorts of information, including personal experience, with regard to the Strom Thurmond Amendment of the 1980s and his efforts nationwide to repeal or mitigate the effects of that amendment. So I will pass it on to Yusuf. And by the way, we did coordinate this
in solidarity, Joe. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and certainly want to thank Joe and his team for arranging such an important conversation. April happens to be, and we're coming up on April, but April happens to be National Second Chance Month, along with National Fair Housing Month. So what I'm going to discuss with you today actually coincides with both of those particular moments. So just before we get started, a quick, if you would, raise your hands. Who here believes that criminal records are a good predictor of tenant success? So looking at someone's past criminal record, how good of a predictor do you think that is in determining if that person would be a good renter in one of your properties? Raise your hand if you think that would be a good predictor. No, stop it. Stop it. Wait, thank you. Thank you. Listen, we're not canceling anyone in the room today. Don't. I should have thought about that before I asked that question. All right. Well, so as it turns out, like most things, the answer is it depends. Okay. Criminal records as a predictor of a tenant's success it doesn't lend itself to the categorical thinking that a lot of us inherently lean into when we consider matters. There's not a linear relationship. As you actually see looking at this graph, it's more of a decaying exponential function when it comes to the predictive value of a criminal record. Yet that characteristic, whether or not someone has been justice impacted, is used oftentimes as the sole basis of determining whether or not someone should have access to a particular apartment. And when we think about what that means, right, someone being able to live in a certain community, oftentimes we have to think about the broader context, because where you live determines so much, not just the schools your children will have access to, or your proximity to your social networks, employment opportunities. But it's a significant decision, and it's something that we tend to think about in a very linear and black and white way. And in fact, that's just simply not the case. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and kind of animate today's discussion. So as noted, I lead an organization called the Century Promise in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where we build career pathways for high school students. Proud graduate of Princeton University, founded Milwaukee Metro Management. It was an award-winning property management company in Milwaukee. Parent of a teenage daughter, so all your prayers would be greatly appreciated. Formerly incarcerated. When I was 18 years old, I was sentenced to prison for 10 years for the distribution of drugs. I mean, blah, blah, blah. I mean, just really have been incredibly fortunate in life and have been able to live a life that I would have never anticipated as just a young man. So, but before we go further, I just want to give you a little bit of a roadmap about what we're going to be discussing today. And it has to do with the intersection of criminal justice, housing, and opportunity. And all three are inextricably linked. So we're going to talk about this by zeroing in on a community that I know very well, which is where I was born, which is the city of Milwaukee. And what this heat map shows you is the percentage of people who have some level of incarceration or involvement with the criminal justice system. And red represents high concentrations of justice involvement, and blue represents low levels of interaction with the criminal justice system. And so what you can see is that this is distributed in a very particular way. There's pockets of the city where you see high levels of incarceration, and there's pockets of the city where you see very low levels of incarceration. And so where I'm from, which is one of these dark red areas, over 40% of Black men by the age of 30 have some level of justice involvement. And so what that meant for my family is that my father was incarcerated, my older brother was incarcerated, and ultimately I was incarcerated. And so location matters. And as we talk about, well, let me, before I go to that slide, we know that geography is correlated with justice involvement. And it stands to reason that if someone was looking to perhaps change their life, change their circumstances, change their friend groups, and avoid that fate of incarceration, they might look to live in a different part of the city that perhaps there aren't these high levels of incarceration. But because of some of the barriers that we're going to talk about today, we're going to learn that oftentimes they are stuck in some of these communities with high levels of incarceration, and ultimately that hurts all of us. So I come at this work from a couple of different perspectives. As mentioned, I own 200 rental units in the city of Milwaukee. I started a real estate entrepreneurship program for folks here in the city of Allentown, and I'm past president of the Wisconsin Apartment Association, where I would do a lot of work in the governor's office advocating for legislation. Maybe you might be able to spot me in this picture. I think you can see, yeah, there you go. Yeah. So what we're going to talk about today specifically is a piece of legislation known as the Thurmond Amendment. Does anyone know Strom Thurmond? Recognize that name? Does it raise your hand if that means something? Yeah. Okay. Well, it's interesting because you all might not have seen it, but there's this distribution in the room where a lot of us older folks know the name very well, and a lot of young people do not. So Strom Thurmond is an interesting figure. Voted against the original Civil Rights Act, the original Fair Housing Act, a strident segregationist, and served in the Senate for a long time. And in 1988, during the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which ostensibly was introduced to extend fair housing protections to people with disabilities, Strom Thurmond introduced an amendment that would remove fair housing protections for life as a collateral consequence of a drug distribution conviction. And so he gets on the Senate floor, and this is what happened.
One conviction is sufficient. My amendment simply says that one conviction is sufficient for a landlord to refuse to rent to a drug dealer. It's that simple. My colleagues to vote for this amendment, failure to do so makes the rights of law-abiding citizens meaningless. Drug dealers deserve no federal protection.
Now, I've watched this video hundreds of times, and it never ceases to amaze me that not a single senator from either party got up and challenged the assumptions that undergird his logic. Because for that to make sense, it assumes that somebody selling drugs is an immutable characteristic that would never change, rather than a poor decision that was made sometimes decades ago. I mean, I liken it to, me getting up here right now and telling all of you that I used to bench press 300 pounds. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not going to help you if you need to move anything, because I certainly can't do it now, right? Like, so it's one of these pieces of information that, again, looking at that graph we showed, that loses its value, its predictive value in terms of telling you anything about that person at that moment. Yet, based on his logic and ultimately legislation, that single piece of information can weigh more than any other market measure of risk that might otherwise be considered. So, what does the Thurmond Amendment mean in Pennsylvania? And what does it mean across the country? And who's impacted and what does that look like? Well, this is data that was collected at Boston University, and it looks at drug distribution convictions in Pennsylvania. So about 80,000 people are subject to the Thurmond Amendment in Pennsylvania. And as you'll see, which stands out on this graph, the two most frequently charged quantities for drug distribution are less than 1 gram and less than 2 grams. Now, I'm hoping that most of you in this room have no idea what a gram of drugs looks like or what that means. But for those who don't know that, it's not a lot. I mean, it's not even enough for a good time with like you and your buddy, like in one night. It's just not a lot of drugs, trust me. And yet these are the folks, these dealer users, right? Like if you have a gram of any type of substance, you're someone who's likely consuming that as well, right? And so for some reason, you were charged with possession with the intent to deliver in Pennsylvania, and as an end result, you lost your fair housing protections for life. And I find it hard to believe that, you know, going back to what Strom Thurmond said, like, is this who we were targeting, right? People with less than a gram of drugs, but then I always struggle because it's Strom Thurmond, and maybe this is what he was targeting, because at the end of the day, this is what we see has happened. So in Pennsylvania, blacks are almost 5 times more likely than whites to be charged with possession with the intent versus simple possession. And one of the things, you know, I struggle with is, as I've been doing this work, is I'm just a very logical person. It's one of the reasons why raising a teenage daughter has been so hard, because right, I look at things just very logically, and she doesn't. And in this case, this situation isn't very logical for me, because if you have a gram of any substance, let's pick cocaine on you, is that possession with the intent or is that possession? I mean, it's like we said earlier, right? There's no right answer to that, but yet we see a systemic pattern on how people are charged with that crime. And so a lot of us have some understanding of the criminal legal system. And so you would say to yourself, okay, if I'm charged with this amount of drugs, what would be the factors in determining if I would have a simple possession charge or the more serious possession with the intent? And some of that comes down to the strength of your legal representation. How good is your lawyer? A lot of it has to do with the community that you're in. Like we just heard some phenomenal work happening in the city of Bethlehem, where there's like a very collaborative, holistic approach to the enforcement of the law. But in other communities, it's a lot harsher. And so folks are being charged with a more punitive charge that has long-term ramifications. And so for me, this is important because it highlights the arbitrary and subjective nature of this particular piece of legislation. And this isn't just a problem in Pennsylvania. Again, this is from Boston University. It's across the country where we're seeing folks impacted. 90,000 people from 1997 to 2022 in Virginia. Some of these disparity ratios are striking. In Wisconsin, blacks are 11 times more likely than whites to have the more serious distribution charge for the same amount of drugs, which would ultimately then trigger the Thurmond Amendment. And just as a baseline, I should note that studies have shown that, like, across racial and ethnic lines, drug usage and consumption is pretty much the same. And yet we're seeing these stark disparities in terms of who's impacted by the Thurmond Amendment, which, if not by intent, certainly would probably be something he would be okay with. So I've talked a little bit about the Thurmond Amendment, what it is, who's impacted. So what can we do about it? Well, there's a few things. At the federal level, last Congress, we introduced the Fair Future Act. It was sponsored by Senator Cory Booker and Congressman Maxwell Frost. We are looking to reintroduce that legislation in the 119th Congress with bipartisan support. So I think Joe had mentioned earlier about the importance of communicating with our legislators. And so if folks are interested, I would encourage you to reach out to our elected officials and encourage them to support the Fair Future Act. At the state level, we're introducing a bill next month, and we're actually going to be holding a luncheon for lawmakers on April 9th in Harrisburg, where we're going to be talking about the Thurmond Amendment, its impact, and the reason why we need to repeal it. So these are both opportunities in terms of how we can tangibly advance this work around removing this artificial barrier to housing and opportunity. So you might be wondering, well, Yusuf, this is great, but why are you, because I should have noted to all of you that if you look this up, you're going to find my name. I started the effort to repeal the Thurmond Amendment. I'm the one that got Cory Booker and Congressman Maxwell Frost to introduce the legislation. Truly, well, no. It's been an unpaid part-time job. And so you might say to yourself, well, why? You know what I mean? Outside of the fact that it's manifestly unjust, please, Mark.
Yeah, just a quick question. So the Pennsylvania amendment, if that passes, does it supplant the federal law?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You're done hearing me talk already. He's trying to move into the question and answer. I understand. I know Mark well. I get it. So it's important to understand how the Fair Housing Act works. It's the best way to think about the Fair Housing Act is like an onion. So the base set of protections is established at the federal level, right? So this is where race is determined as a protected class, where family size, disability. Each state can then enact legislation that strengthens the Fair Housing Act. So as a state, we can put sexual orientation as a protected class. And so the Fair Future Act of Pennsylvania, exactly as it describes, that's what it would do, is it would add this protection, which would essentially repeal the Thurmond Amendment in Pennsylvania, so that if you have a distributed related conviction, you could not summarily be denied housing. And that actually kind of goes into why I've spent so much time, energy, and effort on this amendment. So, as I've shared, it's been a long time since I was convicted of possession with the intent to deliver. And in fact, I know many of you in this room, and all of you know me in a context other than me being a knucklehead when I was 18 years old. In fact, none of you know me. None of you even knew me when I had hair on my head, and you've known me a long time. So I got involved with this because at the time I was running the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Lafayette College. And a local business person approached me about a vision he had to positively impact the Allentown School District. And if any of you know a gentleman named Lee Butts, you know how persuasive he can be and how passionate he can be. And so he motivated me to leave the college and leave this organization to help transform opportunity for kids in the Allentown School District. And so at the time, my daughter was a rising ninth grader. She was finishing elementary school, and we got kicked out of college housing because we were no longer living at the college. So we surveyed the Lehigh Valley and we said, well, what is going to be the best school district that's going to support her academic and athletic interests? She's a really good tennis player. And so we picked a community, went to look at a place, and, I put in the application, paid the deposit, and didn't think anything of it. I mean, to be quite frankly, I've been very fortunate in life, and I could have purchased this particular home for cash if I wanted. And so we go about our business. And 2 days later, I get a phone call from the leasing agent. And gone was the kind of instant rapport we had developed when she was showing me the unit. It was a very different tone in her voice. And so we struggled through the perfunctory greetings, and she finally blurted out, "You were not approved for the apartment." And I, at first was like, are you sure? Like, you know what I mean? Like, are you serious right now? And my daughter says I'm a bit of a Karen in this regard, but I was like, are you effing kidding me right now? And so I said, well, please explain to me. And she said, well, you'll get a letter from us in the mail, and there'll be a process by which you can, take further action. And so I get this letter, and it says that my criminal record did not meet the requirements for that particular unit. And so I thought to myself, well, golly, 25 years of personal and professional responsibility can mean nothing. And you can forever be judged by the worst thing that you have done. And so I was very upset, and I was like, I feel like I need to do something. But ultimately, what got me from just indignation to action was thinking about my daughter. Because ultimately, we had to find a place to live, right? The college didn't care about my sad story. They had already leased it to the new person coming, right? Like, I had to get out of college-owned housing. And so we had to quickly find a place, and we were fortunate to find a place in the Lehigh Valley. But it was at a school district that was so impoverished, they didn't even have a tennis team. And it was, that experience of my daughter having to bear the consequences of something I did a lifetime ago, which really got me from indignation to action, and ultimately was the impetus for the last 3 years of effort in the Fair Future Act. And where we lived, so this is another graph that kind of highlights the connection between geography and opportunity. So this is a graph of our region, and it shows the income potential, or the actual realized incomes of children who were born in certain parts of our city, in certain parts of our region. And the blue areas essentially represent incomes where children exceeded that of the median income for that area. So the darker the blue, the better off the children have done. In the red areas, it's below the median income. And so the red areas represent parts of our community where they did not fare as well. Does anyone want to guess where my family was allowed to live?
Center City, Allentown.
In the red areas. In the red areas. So ultimately, that was what compelled me to take action, and I hope that compels some of you to support this effort to ensure that people who have paid their debt to society have the right to live where they want, not just where they're allowed. So with that, I will take any questions. Mark, you already jumped on yours. We're good. Any other questions from the audience, please?
So with the present framework, what's going on at a national level, how does your efforts get impacted?
Yeah, well, as everyone knows, it's a challenging time. I mean, first of all, federal work is tough going.
Yusuf, could you repeat your question?
So the question was, in the context of the current political environment, how are things going for the Fair Future Act? And I have to be honest with you, had I known it was going to be so difficult at the federal level, I might have just called it a day and picked a different fight. But now it's too late. I'm too far in. Like, there's no going back one way or another. It's going to be repealed. But on one hand, what's happening in DC, just the dysfunction, like nothing is getting done for the most part, right? If it's not an executive order, very few things are happening. So that is a significant headwind to this effort. But where there's challenges, there's always opportunity. And kind of fortuitously for me, 3 years ago when this happened, and I'm talking to organizations across the country, and folks were sympathetic to my story, but they were like, well, it's not transformational enough because Joe Biden was in office. And so there was like bigger fish they were trying to fry. And so, all these things take a lot of time and money and effort. Like moving federal legislation is not easy. And so now that Donald Trump's in office and what's possible has changed, now all of a sudden, all these national groups, I'm not as ugly as I used to be, right? I actually kind of look good. And so I've gotten, there's now a national coalition behind this. So, the Drug Policy Alliance, dream.org, R Street Institute, which is a conservative think tank in DC. We're hoping to land Americans for Prosperity to join the coalition in the coming weeks. So there's a real energy behind this now that is possible precisely because things have become so difficult in DC. Any other questions, please?
What would be your ideal thing to have? Oh, okay.
Recording.
Yeah. What would be your ideal act to have? Because obviously you showed that graph at the beginning where the drug possession stuff does predict how successful a thing is, with the 6-year line or whatever.
Yeah.
Would you factor that into the final ideal act that you would have?
Well, so the final act, so if I could wave a magic wand today and the Thurmond Amendment was gone, all that would mean is that landlords would have to holistically consider your application. So you could, and again, empirically, this has been proven. The fact that I sold drugs 25 years ago tells you nothing about me. Now a lot of you have learned that I've been to prison, and some of you may have not have known that about me. But it actually doesn't change anything in terms of how you think about me because it doesn't tell you anything about me. The fact that I told you I have a 16-year-old daughter is more relevant because that's what I'm going through right now at this moment. And so we know empirically that if the conviction is over 6 years old, it doesn't tell you anything. But by default, our thinking lends itself to categorical thinking, black and white, right? I struggle with my weight quite a bit now as I get older. And so I'm always trying these different diets. And so, but I take these extreme positions. Now I can't have any carbs. Carbs are bad for me. Well, actually, no, right? And even if I could avoid all carbs, I shouldn't. Because it's all about moderation. It's all about context. And so if we repeal the Thurmond Amendment, what it would mean is that true predictors of tenant success, what's your income? What's your credit score? What's your past track record of paying bills, right? What is your rental history? Those things would take precedent. Those would be the factors that would be considered in the rental screening decision. And the irony for all of this for me is think about bankruptcies, right? You file bankruptcy, somebody lost money somewhere down the line, right? A bank, a creditor, somebody. Do we hold that against you for life? After 7 years, we no longer consider that when you go to apply for a loan or some other type of line of credit. And why? Because we know that a past decision in business that did not work out is not a predictor of your future success. And there's been a lot of examples of people who have filed bankruptcy and ultimately became successful. I sold drugs at 18, but ultimately I eventually became successful. And so it's one of these things where this is so common sense. Like, honestly, this is really frustrating for me because it just should not be this difficult. This is common sense. Every apartment association in the country knows this, right? You go on the National Multifamily Housing Coalition's website, you're going to find this type of information. And I should say a number of associations have supported us, the Wisconsin Apartment Association, the Ohio Apartment Association. You know who hasn't endorsed my legislation? Pennsylvania. So if anyone's connected with the Pennsylvania Realtors, the Pennsylvania Apartment Association, let's get it together, guys. Because one way or another, this is going to happen. I assure you, this is going to happen. The question is, are you going to help me? And am I going to come back to Northampton Community College and am I going to say, thank you to the Pennsylvania Apartment Association for doing the right thing? Or am I going to say, I had to do it without you assholes? And I will say that. Trust me, I will say that. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Like you were talking about how like people of color are more likely to get incarcerated. So I wanted to know if it's like also like connected to redlining and how that connects with the amendment you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, but of course, like we know empirically, people of color are more likely to be justice impacted for a host of reasons: economic, policing, etc. I think the relevancy, particularly to the Thurmond Amendment, is that if we know geography is correlated with justice involvement, whether that's because of the resources in that community, the people in that community, if you're trying to avoid going back to prison, you may want to place yourself in a different geography. Right. So all of my friends, when I came home from prison, all my friends still lived in the same neighborhoods, the same, like it was the same social system and structure. And so had I went back to that community, it's likely I might have fallen back in with those group of individuals. But I knew I wanted something different. And so I'm looking to geographically move to a different area where perhaps I don't have proximity to those people and those relationships. And because of the Thurmond Amendment, oftentimes people are constrained in terms of where they can live. And it just has ramifications for their families, for their children, for their spouses. I mean, it's where you live determines a lot, and it shouldn't be subject to an arbitrary law to determine that. And, you know, if I go to a bank, again, what's interesting, I can go to any bank in the Lehigh Valley right now and get a loan. Any bank. Why can I do that? Because they're going to look at things that matter. They're going to look at my credit, my character, my collateral, right? Things that are actually predictors of my ability to pay back the loan. Why should that not be extended to something as simple as rental screening? And the reason it isn't is just because of the way we think. It's just it's a cognitive bias. We look at things in a very black and white way. We categorize things and people and situations where what's needed sometimes is nuance.
So this law impacts anyone who wants any kind of
For the mic.
public, sorry. Sure. This law impacts anyone who's looking for any kind of public housing with federal funding, or how can this law affect private companies who wish to rent to whomever they choose?
Yeah, I need to correct Joe earlier on.
right. He's gonna
This
clean
does not apply to, well, applies to all housing. So the Fair Housing Act governs all housing, whether it's federally subsidized or not federally subsidized. And the other point of clarification, which you will all find interesting, is this only applies to drug distribution convictions. So had I been convicted of armed robbery, had I been convicted of any other crime, they could not have denied my family housing.
So if I own a house that I wish to rent to someone who has been convicted and incarcerated for distribution, I cannot.
No, you could. You have the discretion.
I see.
So right now, let's say you wanted to rent or sell your house. And I said, I would like to purchase or rent your house. And you do a Google search and you say, oh, this guy was incarcerated 25 years ago. You can say, I'm not going to lease you or sell you my home.
But you could, without this law, probably, would there be a
I could sue
legal
you.
rep where you could sue me?
Yeah, if
But now
I
you
had,
cannot.
I cannot.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll come back to you. Yeah.
So seeing how people of color are disproportionately incarcerated for drug offenses, out of all of the crimes that he could have picked to discriminate against, do you think that choosing drugs was an attack on the community of people of color?
Oh, God, I don't know Strom Thurmond. I mean, well, you know his track record, right? I would say this. Look, the reality is, and some of the older folks in this room are going to understand this. In the late 1980s, there was no issue that had more political capital than drugs, right? If I wanted to garner votes right now, today, I would use like gender ideology or something like this. But that's what drugs were in the late 1980s, a way to get votes. And I'm going to tell you, and there's many reasons this thing upsets me, but Strom Thurmond in particular, if you guys know this gentleman's history, the real people think of Strom Thurmond as a racist, an exploiter, all these other things, but you know what he was? He was an opportunist. That's what he was. And so he was an opportunist and he was willing to step on the backs of others to get what was going to benefit him individually. And that's a problem. Like this law today restricts where people can live because it was politically expedient for this guy to do it 40 years ago. And we need to move past it.
If I can just add to that, and I'll get the details right this time, Yusuf. Nixon declared a war on drugs in the early 70s. And decades later, John Ehrlichman, his chief for domestic policy, after some religious conversion, admitted that the purpose of the war on drugs was to target African Americans because they overwhelmingly voted against Nixon. So the racist origin of the war on drugs and the subsequent legislation is pretty well established in the record.
And to be clear, this affects all races and ethnicities, right? I mean, it disproportionately impacts people of color, but in today's political environment, believe it or not, when I went into Congressman Joyce's from Ohio's office, I didn't even give him the information around racial disparities. Like that's in today's political environment, you can't even lead with that. This impacts 80,000 Pennsylvanians, and that's why all of you should care about this. And that's the reason why all of you should email your legislators and say to support the Fair Future Act if they're a state representative, or the federal Fair Future Act if they're a federal legislator. And just one second, and we are going to be targeting because Americans for Prosperity supported Senator McCormick. And so that is an office we are going to be trying to work with. So just throwing that out there.
What's the status of the act in the Pennsylvania legislature?
Yeah, so it's not introduced. It's going to be introduced in April. In fact, we're going up there April 9th, and Joe will have you send out the email. But we're going up there April 9th to hold a luncheon for lawmakers to educate them. The biggest challenge, like what's taken up most of my time in the last 3 years, is just educating people on this issue. So I've written a Washington Post op-ed. I've been featured in a Vice docu-story. I've been on wrote an op-ed in The Hill, a DC-based publication. So it's really been about education, and that's what the 9th is going to be about, because I feel like if folks just understood it, this shouldn't be that difficult.
Do you have the support of the local legislators, the members of the General Assembly and the
Rep. Siegel sponsoring the legislation. I certainly expect all the Democratic delegation to support it. I mean, you would think Republicans too, but it's a tricky moment right now because crime and drugs once again have some political saliency. And so if I'm like right now, we're working with a congressman in Ohio and we've asked him to co-lead the bill in Congress, and we'll see what happens. But I already know what his calculus is. He's thinking to himself, if I come out and support this bill, am I going to be challenged in a Republican primary by someone saying I'm soft on drugs?
So timing is pretty much everything in politics.
That's exactly it.
And so is it appropriate now for each one of us to make a telephone call to an assemblyman who may not know about the bill and is going to just slough it off? Or is there you want everyone's email and then we could, when you indicate it's proper or appropriate, just to help you out. We're all interested in this. I'm a former trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department in the 1970s. We helped in my years there. They were limited because I resigned in protest. But in my years, we helped to define the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And, you know, I want to be on board. I want to help you.
Well, so
You got to tell me how.
Okay, well, so first of all, the time for action is now. Like, make no manner of doubt about that. Like, we do want to educate our lawmakers and let them know this is something this community cares about. And there'll be, like, we're doing a town hall meeting with Congressman Fitzpatrick in Bucks County in April. There'll be more opportunities. But I think the time is now to get this on our lawmakers' radars and say, listen, this is something we care about. This is something we want you to care about. And they're going to be hearing from me. Like, this isn't going away. And I would say the one, again, like kind of fortuitously for me, now all these national organizations, because they just can't stop advocating for reform because Trump's in office, right? Like, you still got to do things. Now they're interested in the Fair Future Act, and I have tremendous support nationally. In fact, I'm going to be doing a briefing in Capitol Hill April 29th to the Drug and Recovery Task Force. So this is an issue that you'll continue to hear more about. There'll be continued momentum, and let's add to it. Let's email them. Let's get it going. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that with regard to your lobby day on April 9th, we will be putting out information on our social media and through our constant contact list. So if you registered for this event, you will be getting our email as long as we don't go to your spam folder. And if we don't have your email address, if you could give it to us here at the back table, we'll make sure you get the information on it.
Yeah, and I'd encourage you, connect with me on LinkedIn or social media, anything like that. It's actually interesting. This whole journey has been chronicled on my LinkedIn from the moment I was denied housing to the moment we introduced the Fair Future Act in Congress last year. So it's let's stay connected. There is a movement, and we would love for all of you to be a part of it. So thank you for coming today. Thank you for showing up, and thank you for fighting for a more just Lehigh Valley.
Get your